I now kindly invite Mr. Joel Turkowitz, Deputy Division Chief of the IMF's Legal Department, to deliver his presentation, which sets the context for our second session, The Road to Credibility: What is Sri Lanka doing about governance concerns? This presentation will explore the critical link between governance reforms and lasting economic credibility, an area that has garnered increasing attention in Sri Lanka's reform journey. Mr. Turkowitz, the stage is yours.
So thank you so much, and hope everyone had a good lunch. Of course, this is always the most dangerous session of any panel, when you watch as people fall asleep after their big lunch, so we'll try to keep it exciting. I also, so thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think it's also, for me, one of the things that I recognize just by the title of this whole event, thinking about debt and governance in some ways as two pillars of the program and two pillars of reform. I think it's important right from the start just to recognize how unique this is. Both unique, I think, for Sri Lanka, but also I think unique for the IMF to be working and seeing governance issues as of the same degree of importance or consequence as debt issues, which have traditionally been where we've the greatest focus. And I think the speeches that we heard this morning from His Excellency, as well as from the first Managing Director, sort of explain also just the critical nature of addressing governance challenges for Sri Lanka's future, for it's the credibility of the reform process, the sustainability of the reform process, and I think critically important, the ability to grow and to grow out of the crisis. With that, let me just start through. Right from the start, I think there was an understanding and appreciation that in Sri Lanka, the issues around the crisis both had an economic nature as well as a governance nature. And that was relatively clear in the fact that the previous government had sort of been forced out of office by a popular protest, where the sort of the largest issue was a challenge about corruption and a sense of inequality in the way the government acted. And therefore, the sense that if these issues were going to be addressed, if the crisis was going to be addressed successfully, that there would need to be action taken both in the area of economic governance, and I think the last session talking through the entire debt restructuring and what was required for the debt restructuring, as well as a look at what were the structural reasons that led to some of the policy choices. Clearly the crisis was created by a whole range of issues, some of which were external to Sri Lanka, the shocks of COVID and others, but some of them were about policy choices and policy choices that appear to have been influenced by structural issues as well as governance issues. And therefore the idea that in order to address the crisis, it was critical to be thinking both about the precipitation of the crisis around the debt, but also in some ways the deeper cause of the crisis, which was centered around governance challenges. And that actually, the way the IMF looked at this was particularly also shaped by the evolving policies of the IMF on governance. Traditionally, we have not worked extensively on governance, although since 1997, the fund has had a policy on governance that said when corruption issues were identified, they should be addressed. But that policy was implemented to varying degrees. In 2018, we had a new enhanced framework for addressing governance that was adopted and approved by the board, which said that actually when corruption issues were determined to be macro-critical, it was essential for the IMF program to address those governance issues. So that once there was a determination that there was a macro-critical nature of the corruption challenge, it was imperative on the IMF to address those challenges in the same way that we address all macro-critical changes, which is if they're essential to be addressed, then they should be part of the program. Also, the governance framework instructed staff to look at corruption in two different dimensions. One, to understand and try to appreciate the severity of corruption, so the extent to which corruption was macro-critical. And the second, to try and understand and appreciate how corruption influenced core state functions. And these are core state functions that are essential for monetary and fiscal policy. And that means that functions in terms of the central bank governance, in terms of financial sector oversight, in terms of fiscal governance, in terms of market regulation, in terms of the rule of law, which is around contract and property rights, and in terms of money laundering and the integrity of the system. So the fund has a framework that says when we approach corruption issues, we approach it thinking not as basically corruption as a criminal issue, but more that corruption is an economic issue and has economic consequences based upon its impact upon how the state functions. This was exactly how we approached corruption and governance issues in Sri Lanka. So right from the start, there was an appreciation that that corruption was a macro-critical issue in Sri Lanka, and therefore the program had to address it and identify the nature of the problem and work through exactly both what were the governance weaknesses that were associated with corruption and how to address them. The keystone and the centerpiece of the fund's work on governance corruption was the governance diagnostic. The governance diagnostic is an exercise and a tool that was created by the IMF in 2018. It's done by the request of a government. And the government of Sri Lanka, and I think in a really important move, requested the IMF to do a governance diagnostic. It was the first time in Asia that a government had requested a governance diagnostic be done. It showed a determination on the part of the government to deal with governance issues as part of its economic reform program. And just to emphasize, when we started the governance diagnostic, at the kickoff meeting, the focal point from the government said, we have requested this diagnostic because we have a tradition of having reform progress, only for that reform progress to be then superseded and to go back. And we need to find ways for the reform to be sustainable. And we see the governance diagnostic, and we see the governance reforms that will be associated with the governance diagnostic as fundamental for the sustainability of reform. And I think that sense that this is a critical both aspect and feature, but also is fundamental to sustainability and to making the structural changes that are required is an essential element that has sort of informed the exercise going forward. So we did the governance diagnostic was performed. We started in 2022, and the diagnostic itself was published, I believe, in August of 2023. It was a structural benchmark of the program. We had extensive stakeholder analysis, which meant that we spoke not only to the government, but to a whole range of different stakeholders, including civil society and the private sector. What the governance diagnostic found was that there was systematic and severe corruption across core state functions, and that there were a bunch of shared elements to that. One was limited independence and accountability of key institutions. A second being legal and regulatory framework issues that were limited overall fiscal discipline and transparency. And overall, what we found was instead of accountability performance, there was a strong emphasis on direct control of policy and individuals. So rather than having an accountability structure that required performance and held organizations accountable performance, you had individual control. And in addition, you had an anti-corruption system that did not work very effectively, so there's a high degree of impunity. Coming out of the diagnostic, there were 16 fundamental recommendations that were made. Those 16 fundamental recommendations spanned a variety of different dimensions. Many of them were focused on increasing transparency, such as increasing transparency around procurement, around tax exemptions. Some of them were focused on reducing conflict of law or strengthening organizational and individual accountability. There were recommendations, for example, on the National Audit Office. There were sets of recommendations about enhancing the rule of law, enhancing the effectiveness of the judicial service sector, as well as recommendations about improving basically policies, practices, and the people who work in government as a way of changing the incentives that operate on individuals and organizations, changing outcomes, as well as changing expectations of the public of what to expect from government officials going forward. So I want to emphasize that those recommendations have then been followed up in the program. Of those 16 priority recommendations, 10 of those recommendations became structural benchmarks in the program. 4 of them are reflected in the government's financial plan, and the diagnostic was published. So this was not just a private exercise or a limited exercise. This was an exercise that truly influenced the funds program in Sri Lanka, and as well as the governance programs in Sri Lanka. I want to turn, so far I've talked quite a bit about what the IMF has done. I want to sort of switch a little bit to a greater focus on the government's approach and what the government has done relative to the diagnostic, because ultimately the reforms are driven and are the government's reforms. It's the IMF can support those reforms, but ultimately those reforms are the government's reforms. And what have we seen so far in terms of progress on governance? And I think it's important to recognize both that there's a lot to do and a lot to go on, but also that there have been substantial achievements that have happened over the last 2 to 3 years, which is a very short amount of time. One has been the adoption of a government action plan, where the government itself says, these are the things that we are committed to doing. This is a timeline. This is an action plan that gets published on a yearly basis and gets updated. The government is making progress also on monitoring progress and making that monitoring public. A second thing that's happened is there have been significant improvements in the policies and legal frameworks. And this was mentioned already previously in things like the anti-corruption law, the banking law, and other legal enactments. A third dimension has been there's been a strengthening of institutions, including the anti-corruption agency, CBOC, and we'll have the commissioner of CBOC on the panel coming up. A fourth dimension has been there's been greater transparency, including things like the publication of procurement winners, or the publication of the value of tax exemptions. And I would also emphasize the first publication of the asset declarations of the 300 top public officials. And I think it is important to just note that it has contributed to the improved economic outcomes. I want to say that in each of these, I think it's both important to acknowledge change and the progress that's been made, while not overstating that these problems have been solved. These are the first steps, and I think our view has always been that the first phase of work was to create momentum around reform on governance in order to enable further reforms to happen and to increase. Moving towards the forward-looking dimension, what do we see as critical in the next phase? One of those things is completing the ongoing reforms, such as completion of the public procurement law, which I appreciate is actually an issue of discussion, and I'm happy to sort of have that further discussion. Second thing is to ensure implementation of things that have already started. So the asset declaration law and the first set of asset declarations are published. Next year, the e-asset declaration system will come fully online, which will create just a different way of implementation. A third dimension is to expand the commitment to transparency and information exchange. There's already additional information that's being provided, but there's much more to go. I think a fourth dimension is raising expectations to abide by the rule of law. And this, I think, is a fundamental thing, since there's a very clear evidence about the importance of expectations that the rule of law will be followed. This is especially important in terms of private sector behavior, but it's also important in terms of the behavior of us individuals. So raising those expectations that the government will abide by the rule of law. And finally, the last dimension is developing coalitions for reform, because one of the things we know about governance reforms is when a governance reform succeeds, there's always pushback and an effort to retrench. So there should be an expectation that all of the governance reforms that have happened to date, there will be pushbacks and efforts to recreate the past systems as people protect their corruption rents. So what do I mean by developing coalitions for reform? It means within the government, creating capable institutions operating with clear mandates and objectives. It means in the private sector, having a private sector that benefits not from agreements with the government and side agreements with the government, but a private sector that actually benefits by fairness and by the application of the rule of law. It means a set of international partners, including groups like JICA, the World Bank, and ADB, as well as the international financial community, who all have a stake in continuing to support Sri Lanka's continued reforms. And it also includes civil society, which has played a huge role right from the start in both the generator of reform, as well as a contributor to ideas about and priorities for governance reform, as well as actively monitoring that reform. And it's critical for civil society to continue to play that role and deepen that role. With that, I want to conclude my part of the presentation, and we're going to move now into a panel discussion, which I will have my colleague announce. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turkowitz, for that insightful presentation that lays the groundwork for what promises to be a thought-provoking discussion. So as Mr. Turkowitz now takes on the role of the moderator, I'm very pleased to welcome our esteemed panelists to the stage, Honorable Dr. Harshana Surya Peruma, Deputy Minister of Finance and Planning, Mr. K.B. Rajapaksha, Commissioner, Commission to Investigate Allegations of Bribery or Corruption, Siabok, Mr. Murtaza Jafferji, Chairperson, Advocata Institute, and Professor Arjuna Parakrama, Professor of English, University of Peradeniya.
So thank you one and all for coming. It's so nice to see you. I feel like I'm with old friends because we have, over the course of these years, all worked together and had many discussions about this topic. I feel like I just sort of quickly ran through 2 to 3 years of intensive work. And so looking forward very much to this discussion, which is, as you can see, an attempt to try and have a number of different stakeholders, everyone who's been deeply involved in this process, talk from different perspectives, both about governance challenges, governance, the progress that's been made, as well as the challenges in front. And I think looking forward to a very interesting discussion. We're trying to make sure that we maintain at least 10 minutes for questions and answers, so we'll jump right into it. I'm going to start with you first, Professor Parakrama. The professor was the lead author of the governance diagnostic that was drafted by civil society, which was not a copy or a mirror of the IMF diagnostic, but it was their own view on what the core issues were. You've been working and writing about governance in Sri Lanka for many years. Can you just discuss briefly the core governance challenges that you and others from civil society identified?
First is governance against corruption must address both retail, that is visible, and systemic, or what I call quiet corruption. The present government has made real progress in dismantling the culture of impunity in Sri Lanka, for which it should be congratulated and supported, but this is only in the sphere of retail or visible corruption. Systemic corruption in decision-making itself, where there is no discernible perpetrator or group, no obvious villain, still flourishes, unchecked in key sectors, as acknowledged by the President himself. The immediate threat of state capture is averted but systemic issues are more pivotal in maintaining corrupt practice. Post-Trump, I loathe to describe this as deep state, because as you know what he calls a deep state. So I identify it as invisible or quiet corruption, acknowledging Shanta Devarajan. There is little understanding or targeting of this systemic layer, generally simplistically blamed on the bureaucracy. Hence, Sri Lanka's challenge is to address invisible, quiet corruption, not merely identifying those engaged in rent-seeking, nepotism, fraud, etc. Open, transparent public consultation is key to addressing the quiet corruption riddling our economy. The government must prioritize serious and sustained consultations with the citizenry. In fact, where a broad consultative process has been written into the recommendations, they appear misunderstood and trivialized as one of three options. One, discussion within government. There's a lot of that. Two, discussions with one or two powerful national NGOs or think tanks. And three, discussion with organizations that raise concerns after the draft legislation has been gazetted. And there are plenty of examples. The rest, they say, is history. This non-consultation leads to lack of public ownership, mis- and disinformation, legal challenges, public protests, as well as, most importantly, errors and issues that could have been rectified earlier through frank, informed discussion, which requires a safe space and enabling environment. It is only such public consultation that can uncover the depth and extent of conflict of interest, unequal treatment, and procedural unfairness. Lack of consultation affects the marginalized most. That's the second point. Lack of consultation leads to mistakes and injustice, and the least powerful are the worst affected. So but in positive terms, such serious open consultation is the highway to credibility and public support. I will use the DDR that targeted Sri Lanka's main social security fund as a symptomatic example to demonstrate the danger of non-consultation. Many will dispute, and it has been done today, both my data and conclusions, but that is precisely the point. Lack of consultation allows many versions of the truth to flourish. As Shakespeare's Banquo in Macbeth says, I quote, "To betray us is in deepest consequence." Right. So background to the EPF. We have the EPF balance is huge, as you know, with 2.6 million active accounts. The point is, it's a forced saving for non-government sector employees, 92% of whom earn less than the taxable minimum. EPF income is taxed, therefore, at 14%, which discriminates against the lower income workers. The annual income from this is between 40 to 50 billion, and I say that can be raised through increasing the cigarette tax to the 75% that the WHO benchmark. And I will show that in the next slide. Millions rely on the EPF for their retirement security. This is the main social security fund. The DDR on EPF incurs present value cost of about 400 billion, which is about 15% of the total. But what makes the anomaly is the manager of the EPF is also its punisher. So here's a cigarette tax to show you that the tax in price of cigarettes has gone down, the lowest in 16 years. It's below the benchmark. We don't know why. No consultation, no discussion. There must be rationale, but we don't know. Seems very clear that if you were to do this, we could then rationalize this as well and not penalize the poorest, those who don't have a voice. There is no consultation. It's the voiceless, the subaltern who get discriminated. And it also leads to this. This is, I think, important based on IMF data. Shows Sri Lanka is the only one of 14 recent DDR cases to target social security funds exclusively, whereas others focused on banks and private creditors. Let's be frank, the targeting of the EPF funds was convenient, doubly convenient because of the conflict of interest. If you have a bank with 7 shareholders, the 7 will protest. But here, the manager, the administrator, is the one who's determining the cut. So, again, the decision may be right for some, but the process should be wrong for everyone. That is my point. The process is wrong. So if you look at the issue here, so the benchmark is, the recommendation is broad consultative process produces a cabinet policy by June 24th. This has not been followed. No broad consultation process, no consultation process. If you look at this, and here I want to expand this, I'll read it to you. The tracker says that the new revised benchmark, remember this was removed from the first action plan in February 2024, and it was approved as removed. There were 16 recommendations, 15 came in the benchmark, this was removed. Then it was reintroduced this year, but reintroduced saying that a subcommittee will be appointed by April, not appointed. So the other benchmarks can't be met. If we rush to fulfill the December 2025 deadline, then we will rush the consultation. Come on, if it is a procurement issue, then there's a lot of time. How much time will it take to appoint a committee? 1.5 years? So that's the question of credibility. So looking at all of this, I will, I think, go to the final recommendation, which is what I propose. Don't trivialize public consultation. Conduct a transparent nationwide consultation like the PUSAL on tariff hearings when designing an independent governing board for EPF. Convert all 16, the 10 have been converted, but convert 16, and abolish the 14% tax on EPF income. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. Honorable Mr. Harshana, as Deputy Minister, you play a critical role in shaping the government priorities to improve governance, integrity, and accountability. Could you please talk a little bit about the government's priorities as presented in the Government Action Plan? I think Professor has indicated, and I think aligned with the CSO diagnostic, this critical importance that is placed on having an effective way of consulting with others as a way of ensuring or increasing the probability that the policies are well conceived and take into consideration the different perspectives. So if you could speak to that and a little bit about the governance, how you conceive of the governance action plan.
Thank you very much, Joel. I think it's an interesting analogy to see how the public consultation and keeping the public aware of what is going on and the type of change that we can bring about. In fact, that is what the present government did when we were not in the government. We kept public engaged continuously because we believe the challenges that we had as a country is not merely economic related ones, Joel. Some of these issues that we had as a country is because of lack of governance in many of the processes, led to extreme level of corruption. Just to highlight the way how the impacted to the entire nation is that this resulted in bringing the economy down. And not only we had a very poorly operating economy, beneath that or separate your coexistence with that one is having different types of operations to the extent something was in the borderline to the criminal side of the economy, and politicians and certain businesses were operating as if the law is not applicable to them. So there were severe challenges in terms of the way how country operated. No wonder it gave the results as a country that we all had to endure, particularly the poorest and the most vulnerable segments. So our view is we presented very clearly our approach in terms of governance, the present government, in our manifesto, as to what are the ways and means through which we need to look at it. If I were to summarize, what is now, what is next, and what is in the long run. If you look at what is now, there were immediate priorities as the government that we need to attend to. That is to establish the rule of law, give hope to law-binding citizens that doing the right thing is okay, because the deep-rooted level of corruption, lack of governance in the society, it has created an impression that you don't have to comply, you don't have to pay taxes. So the level of, to the extent at which it has gone across the social fabric, it was very difficult for the country to continue. However, we can remember that is part of the past. I can remember in 2022, few hundred meters away from here, there were major protests and uprising. Just 2 weeks back at this very premises, there was an event held that I attended. It's about cross-border listing. Within a short period of time, how Sri Lanka has transformed, that is to the credit of the state officials. The governor is there, ST is there, and the team members who had the data, and to ensure right things need to be put forward to the decision makers. In consultation with those decision makers, we take that journey to the next level. It is not only that, the politicians give the example by action that we are willing to do the right thing. Once again, I'll pick an example, Joel. In the governance diagnostic report of IMF, one of the action points was Sri Lanka was supposed to identify 10 state institutions who have done procurement over 1 billion and put it into a public platform where anyone from anywhere else in the world could look at who has been awarded, etc. Since the new government came into place, this item was in the pending list and it was not implemented. I don't see it as an issue, but it's a question of the political will to go that extra mile and to do those. Since the new government took over, within a very short period of time, less than 60 days, we got the resources in place. We were working with the state institutions involved, spoke to those institutions who were identified as the 10 entities, and it is online. As of today, the institutions and the details of their procurements over 1 billion are available online for anyone to see, ask questions, even if it is after the process. That is the level of transparency the current government is believing. Then I get into the segment of next. This is where what we do is not only on haphazard basis or not only based on the efficiency of an individual. Some of these reforms is expected to be structural and expected to be there for a longer period of time as well. This is why we welcome this type of engagements, expertise, where people have done it elsewhere and achieved some successful results. So as a government, we are continuing with the work that it has been delivered in the past, continued in the past. I'll take few examples. The Public Debt Management Office, it has been established and it is continuing. Similarly, activities relating to the corruption, the CBOC, I'm sure we will hear more in a short while. The structural reforms relating to the SOE side of it, that is yet to come, to make sure that the government is able to deliver what people are asking for. So several initiatives of that nature is getting implemented. I'm sure rest of the items are kept for the long term in terms of implementation. Our government is serious in terms of facilitation, these reforms that we discuss, to make sure that is in the best interest of the country. We endeavor to ensure that adequate consultation is there, as Professor highlighted, to make sure that we get feedback, that we get the contribution from other segments of the society as well. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you so much. I think some really interesting both perspective as well as commitments. I hear the commitment to say we see this. There were some things that we prioritized, which was visible adherence to law and visible adherence to rules, and that we believe that there are structural issues that continue to need to be addressed. We see these as things that we will come to and prioritize. So I think, thank you, very, very useful. I'd like to turn to Chairman Rajapaksa. You as one of the commissioners on CBOC, on the Anti-Corruption Agency, are actually on the front line in many ways of changing the approach to addressing corruption. With the new anti-corruption law, CBOC has been given extensive new authority and responsibilities, and therefore the progress of anti-corruption is also particularly associated and linked with CBOC's ability to build an institution and to fulfill its functions. I'd like you to just talk briefly a little bit about the things that CBOC has done in these last couple of years as you see as demonstrating progress and creating the type of institution that's needed for Sri Lanka.
Thank you very much, Joel, for the invitation. As a result of reforms, since enacted new Anti-Corruption Act number 9 of 2023, we have established ourselves as a truly independent commission with commissioners, new director generals, from a clear process. And from this new Anti-Corruption Act, the scope and mandate has been expanded, not limited to bribery or corruption. It has been extended to money laundering activities, private sector bribery, offences under sports events, bribery of foreign public nationals, trade in influence, conflict of interest, etc. And also, there is a protection for whistleblowers. So, there is a clause, whistleblower protection. And also, institutional capacity building and legislative development. So with that, we started our commission. Then we realized there were lot of long outstanding cases, files. So we decided we needed more lawyers, prosecutors to manage these things. Then we hired, we doubled our lawyers, prosecutors last year. Then we want to expedite especially high profile, PEP and high corruption cases. And also we recruited another approximately 50 new investigators for the investigation of high profile and complex cases, focusing winning judgment of convictions. So then they are in the field at the moment. They do their job very well. In addition to that, we established a special unit under the direct purview of Director General, especially give attention to high profile PEP cases and high corruption cases. So the investigators and lawyers, they are focusing to file more indictments, get more convictions from this process. And we modernize how it manages their cases. So we improved our organization, how it operates from the commission itself. So then we thought there were some files more than 15 years. So anyway, we have to manage, we manage it. The mandate has been given by the new act. Very independently, we can manage the acts. And also, the general public, they are always asking why we are not refiling some of the cases. We have refiled the cases again. For the last 12 months, no case has been dismissed due to technical error. So, also, there is a dedicated team we have appointed to the special unit to finalize these outstanding matters. So, and also we improved our investigative procedures and methods. So you can see now from the media, you can see how we investigate, then we change our investigative methods with the appointment of new Director General. In addition to that, we established 2 special units. We call Assets Declaration Management Unit and Money Laundering Investigation Unit. We are the central collection authority of assets and liability declarations. So we established that unit, as Joel mentioned from his previous slide. We published last year, the first time in the history, over more than 300 number of asset and liability declarations with redacted version, because we have to keep some confidentiality from the public. And we wanted to strengthen the partnership with local and international agencies. We do that. Now we have begun to achieve results. So we do more indictments. Very recently, we were able to obtain very successful convictions for bribery cases and also for corruption cases. Some are online. So with that, we have already freezing and seizing powers. We use those powers when it is necessary. And in addition to that, we have created our strategic plan with clear priorities, milestones, and objectives, and also aligned with government reforms supported by IMF as well. In addition to that, last April we launched our national action plan, not only limited to the Siabok and for the whole country. I think we are turning to the successful gradually to implement the provisions and the powers given by the new act.
So great, and thank you so much. I mean, I think the success, part of the success of Sri Lanka's work on governance will be, are you able to create institutions and build institutions that are fit for function and achieve their objectives? And I think there's a lot of knowledge to experience to demonstrate this is a tremendous challenge. But I think CBOC, as you know, in the creation of a strategic plan, in the dedication of resources to high-value contracts, in the increase and improvement in your human resources, and directing those human resources to cases that matter, to producing asset declarations that are visible to all, so there can begin to be an accountability and oversight of government officials. These are all very important steps in the creation of an institution that serves its function. I guess I would just emphasize also that throughout this, I think one of the things has been that CBOC has been being supported by international groups, including ADB, including JICA and others in the World Bank. And I think this also demonstrates the importance of these partnerships that are going to be so critical in actually implementing and having the government change the way it acts. Murtaz, I want to come to you to last. I think we've had this discussion a bit about sort of these overall challenges, I would say, around how the government operates and the processes by which the government operates and the extent to which that leads to good governance. I think we've heard from the government about priorities and the structures they have started to put in place to change the way government operates. We've heard from CBOC about the changes that they have started to institutionalize and the changes and the progress they've made. I want to turn to you and have you sort of reflect a little bit on, maybe this is more in the economic governance universe, of what does the private sector need to see in order to invest, in order to sort of, what has been the progress so far, and what does, from a perspective outside of government, what do you see as essential in order to continue progress or give those grounds? So, Murtaz.
Thank you, Joel. Let me try to be concise with what I'm trying to say here. First, some definitions. I mean, people confuse corruption and governance. So corruption is an abuse of public office for private gain. And governance is defined as the institutions, the mechanisms, the procedures through which government power is exercised. Now, the public narrative is Sri Lanka's problems were due to corruption, what I call misappropriation. But the bigger damage was done through misallocation and mismanagement. A very graphic example of this is Sri Lankan Airlines. where a former CEO tried to misappropriate $16.5 million. He succeeded in getting $2 million, but he misallocated $200 million. So part of that $16.5 million was $1.2 million for 4 leased aircrafts. The cancellation of those 4 aircrafts cost us $115 million. And the outgoing CEO recently told me that even the procurement of smaller aircrafts, which was outside this contract, because they did not have competent people sitting on the board who knew aviation, they procured it without the necessary warranties. And since it was a neo engine, the engine has been giving continuous trouble, impacting the performance of the airline. So I would like to touch on 3 things that were put in that have made a difference: the central bank, the Ministry of Finance, and anti-corruption. Let me start first with anti-corruption. Siabok governor talked about a few things. There are 2 important things in the anti-corruption law: sexual corruption. And some of the other CSOs who come for meetings, they lobbied to get in sexual corruption, and I'm sure that the commissioner is not at liberty to speak about it, but there are a number of cases of private sector sexual corruption basically that they are investigating, which is sending a strong signal on behavior in the private sector. The second is conflict of interest and gifts. Now, there is a very strong nexus between pharma companies and doctors. Generally, doctors get junkets. Because of the law, that practice cannot be continued anymore. That providing junkets for doctors to go for conferences, etc., unless it's very specific, that practice has stopped. So this is one graphic example how the new governance environment changes behavior. The second is with the central bank. Now, there is a very different law. So they have to focus on price stability. There is no monetary financing. There is a 2-board structure. The nominations go through the Constitutional Council. Now, we have had to face situations where 2 successive governors have come out and publicly said that money printing doesn't create inflation. When people ask about the exchange rate, you get callous responses like the importers and exporters are having a fight. I mean, now you have a much more professional institution where the exchange rate, as they have said, will be market determined. So as business people, you have less variables to think about. You know, you're not so strategic in your choices, thinking what will they do? They have to act according to their mandate. There's a new banking law. And the banking law has ensured that basically there's a single borrower limit. So the issue of competitive neutrality, especially in SOEs, where they had unlimited access to financing and could continue to make large losses, no longer is going to be possible. Of course, it's being phased in because these companies are going, even if they are not divested, they will not have unlimited access to state bank funds, nor will they have access to guarantees from the government because it will have to be costed. And finally, on the fiscal side, basically, that there are defined trajectories on the primary balance and primary expenditure and on capital expenditure. And there is a broad-based tax system because one of my pet peeves is that tax system is creating winners and losers through distortion. One, through relative prices. So when you exempt some items from VAT and other items not from VAT, you create a difference in relative prices. And therefore, you create winners and losers. So these were 3 graphic examples, Joel, that have gone into to place, and it has fundamentally changed the way you do business.
Great, so thank you. I think very clear examples of how governance changes can change incentives and can change your relationship and susceptibility of governance arrangements to actually excessive discretion or malfeasance or corruption. I think very nice examples. I think this breadth of discussion of CBOC of looking at how do you enforce the law effectively, because law enforcement is critical as a way of creating the proper incentives and to ultimately build rule of law. as well as the structural changes that have changed incentives and changed behavior. I have been told very strongly that we need to make sure that this session ends at 3:45. We were going to have another round of questions about the future, but I actually want to turn it over to see if there are questions from this floor. Because if there are questions from the floor, now would be the time to ask them. Otherwise, we'll go to another round of questions. But would anyone please come in and questions from the floor? Okay, going once, going twice. Okay, then we will then continue to, oh, please. Can someone get her a mic?
I'm Senior Manager Advocacy from Transparency International Sri Lanka. While the government is speaking and highlighting all the things the government has been doing right, I think as watchdogs, it's our duty, there are a couple of CSOs here, to point out and question what the government is not doing right. And as Professor Parakram said, one is the lack of maybe absence of public consultations in decision making, policy, and legislation formulation. So let me just give a quick example. Now, the commissioner and even Joel mentioned about asset declarations. So asset declarations are being public, very good, very progressive. While the government gets to sort of take the credit and talk about how it is a progression to have asset declarations public, I can very responsibly mention that the reason why it's public is because we argued and negotiated with the Ministry of Justice at the time to make it public. When the draft law came out, the asset declarations were not supposed to be publicly accessible. So why is it now accessible? Because the CSOs, we forced, as always, we force ourselves into the process because there is no open call for consultation and there is no consultation. So that is why now you're able to say that, look, 300 asset declarations are public. It's okay that the credit doesn't go to the CSOs, but my question is there a mechanism, at least now, because it's rather ironic for all the CSOs, I think majority of the CSOs would agree that we expected a government that came on an anti-corruption narrative, open participatory narrative to power, to be more open to the public and to be participatory. So in that context, what is the mechanism, if there is any, of the government to have open consultative process on legislation formulation?
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to come in? Because I'd like to just weave that in then to just the second round of questions, which are going to be about sort of next steps and what do people see as priorities. But perhaps, Dr. Harshana, do you want to start perhaps partially by responding to the question and also?
Sure, thank you. I suppose it's a question, given the social and political structure that we had in the country. This is why, because many lived with impunity, as if the law is not applicable to them. So several groups have to get together and start pushing government to do the right thing. This is why a mandate has now been given to a government to do the right thing in the first place. So our approach is, when regulation is being formulated, wherever possible, conduct those consultations in an expeditious manner. Some of the pieces of legislation that was in the making, it has gone through a certain distance. Some level of consultation was completed already, etc. And there's a need as well to urgently finalize some of those legislations as well. For example, the Audit Act, if you look at it, and some of the changes to the Companies Act, where ultimate beneficial shareholders to be identified. So I'm just picking some examples. So there are several rounds of consultation that have taken place in the past, but nevertheless we engage stakeholders into those consultations. I'll take one example. We are reviewing some of the acts that are to be finalized very soon. Within the last 4 to 6 weeks, we have had consultation sessions with 42 different government agencies. We have called unions, we have called chambers involved, just to give one example on one of those pieces of legislation that we are reviewing. This is to showcase the present government is not just limiting it to the words or books. We are actually implementing it, practicing it, working with the industry, private sector, and some of the committee members in that committee. We in fact got down from the previous committee that was set up by the previous government. To that extent, so we don't lose the expertise and the hard work in some of these areas that they have done. So to make sure it is not about politics, but it is doing the right thing by Sri Lanka. Same applies to the governance report that has been produced by IMF. It is not because someone says that Sri Lanka needs to be done. We need to know as a country, Sri Lanka needs to uphold governance, establish these principles allowing citizens to have faith in the system and credibility in the system. So once again, to conclude, Joel, the present government is serious about it, and we have demonstrated in action in some of the work that we have already done, that we are open for suggestions. Anyone can always make submissions to us. After going through the initial work, obviously through the parliamentary process also, it allows submissions. I'm sure Harsha is here with us, honorable member. Even to the Committee on Public Finance, several times there were individuals who have and institutions that would have made submissions, etc. So multiple opportunities to be heard and your ideas and views to be taken into account when we are formulating policy. Thanks, Joel.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to come in. We have a minute per panelist, and I do just ask that you stick to your minute. But Professor, do you want to start us off?
It appears that the perception, which is reality, the perception is that the economic injustice is exacerbated by the fact that the architects of the economic crisis do not bear any part of the burden of its proposed reform, which has again been firmly thrust without any dialogue on the victims of this crisis. So I think those who are the most vulnerable are the ones who don't get a voice, and therefore they are the ones affected. So my proposal is, why don't we work on the human rights-based approach to economic growth and development? I know the IMF is not committed to that, but Sri Lanka, through the common understanding in the UN and so on, is committed. And what are those? They are participation, accountability, non-discrimination, equality, empowerment, and linkages to international human rights law. If we follow that, then I think we will have both equity and development, growth that is tied to governance.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Rapaksa, 1 minute to just talk about one or two things at CBOC that you see as critical for CBOC.
Actually, CBOC needs to establish credibility, trust and confidence among all stakeholders, local and international as well. In addition to that, so we want to mention that we are moving to digitalization process. The file tracking, case management system we have already almost to launch within 1 month, and also e-asset declaration will be coming next year. The development has been started, and other thing is the record room digitalization. So it has been it's being developed, and also the other thing is every day we follow each and every complaint. I want to answer the Murtada's the question. So if we get the complaint, so we review each and every complaint, whether anonymous or by way of writing or email, online, whatever the way, we analyze, we review. Thing is, we don't have sufficient evidence, sufficient documents, sufficient production to go ahead with that investigation. That is the lack of the people. So that's why we want to make awareness. The prevention is in this set, the covering prevention area also in this set. We want to make awareness from kindergarten, school, university students, and all public servants, the value of the integrity, and educate the people. Then what are their rights? Then they know. Some people think accepting is bribery is the offense. Same, the offering is also same offense. So we want to make awareness. I think with that we can have a good society.
I'm going to stop you there. Just for time purposes. So let me stop you there and ask Murtaz to come in.
Okay.
Apologies.
So Joel, I'll repeat the definition of governance. Governance is the institutions, mechanisms, and procedures through which government power is exercised. It is not a costless exercise. Even in a company, if you want to have a quality board, you can't simply rely on people's altruistic motives. It is going to cost you. So as my colleague, Professor Rohan Samrajiva was discussing in the morning, one thing to watch out is what is the budgetary allocation to these institutions. And there was a conversation that I had 1.5 years ago with opposition parliamentarian who was a member of the Constitutional Council. There was a debate between some people of how much to pay for the Director General of Searbox salary. The crooks in the room were lowballing the figure because then you were setting up the institution to fail. And the good guys were arguing for a much higher salary because you want to attract talent in. And to me, basically, if governance is, this whole governance effort is going to be maintained and prosper, the government of the day must also sufficiently resource. And these institutions should be broken out of the traditional administrative rules and financial rules and say that we can't pay, we have to only pay certain salaries. You'll never get a good outcome.
So great. Thank you so much. I think obviously issues around corruption as well as issues around governance are very broad, and we could clearly spend a much longer time talking about this. I would just emphasize that I think in these last 2 to 3 years, Sri Lanka has made impressive steps on first acknowledging and identifying core corruption challenges, understanding and appreciating some of the underlying structural governance weaknesses, has begun to start addressing that. And that means both changing policies, beginning to change institutions, and create expectations. All of those are going to be critically important. And going forward, it will be critically important to demonstrate results, both in terms of things like, well, actually showing that impunity doesn't exist and prosecuting people. I think holding people to account and organizations to account for their performance, establishing greater clarity into policies and considering conflict of interest and incentives, and ensuring that core government functions like procurement or licensing or land, these issues are well regulated and operate in accordance with the rule of law. And I think the core thing on governance is always that government and the state have to recognize the importance of procedural checks and balances to operate with constraints and operate by the rule of law in order to achieve better results. And this is always a challenge, and it's a challenge that gets defined and determined by local forces and domestic forces. So it is a Sri Lankan discussion between government and society and different forces. And what needs to be defined is not for Sri Lanka to follow a model that has been done in another country or the IMF suggests, but indeed finding something in Sri Lanka that works for Sri Lanka. And what by works means that increasingly there's a way to demonstrate improved governance, improved performance, improved integrity, and better lives for people, both individually and socially. With that, I just want to thank everyone, not only for I thought a very good panel discussion, but just also for the commitment and work that's gone into your perspectives. So thank you very much.